The sun had not yet risen, but the Kyzylkum Desert had already begun to breathe. This breath was dry as ash and smelled of scorched stone. Mark stood on the edge of the plateau, adjusting the straps of his 25-kilogram backpack. He was an experienced trekker, a man accustomed to testing his limits. His plan was a solo crossing through the Valley of Whirlwinds, a stretch where the sand shifted into clay takirs and then back into endless dunes. 80 kilometers in 48 hours. It was a challenge he had set for himself for his 40th birthday. His preparation had been manic. He had studied satellite imagery, calculated every gram of food, and brought the best 6-liter hydration bladder along with 2 1-liter flasks filled with electrolytes. He knew that in the desert, the key isn't speed, but rhythm. Mark began his movement, feeling the soles of his boots grip the ground firmly. The first 10 kilometers passed like a dream. He enjoyed the solitude. The desert seemed to him a majestic temple where he was the only parishioner. But the desert does not tolerate overconfidence. It waits for the first mistake to turn it into a fatal one. Around 10 in the morning, when the temperature had already climbed past 35 degrees Celsius, Mark decided to take a shortcut through a small gully. He had seen it on the map, the short bed of a dried-up river. At the bottom of the gully lay fine gravel mixed with soft sand. One careless step on a rock that turned out to be loose and unstable, and Mark's world flipped upside down. He heard the sound before he felt the pain. A dry, short crack, like a pencil snapping. Mark fell on his right side, and the heavy backpack, with all its mass, pinned him against a sharp outcropping of sandstone. Pain flared instantly. Hot, electric, it traveled from his ankle to his very spine. But there was another sound, one that was far worse, a whistling hiss. Mark turned sharply, ignoring the nausea from the pain. From the pocket of his backpack, where the soft water bladder lay, a stream was erupting. The sharp stone had pierced both the tough nylon of the bag and the thin membrane of the hydrator. Water, his life, his fuel, his only chance, was soaking into the dry sand. Mark lunged for the backpack, trying to pinch the hole with his fingers, but the water was too fast. It was sucked into the earth with a greed that words cannot describe. 10 seconds later, it was over. Less than 300 milliliters remained at the bottom of the bladder. Between that and his flasks, he had little more than a liter of water left. For 2 days of travel in 48 degrees Celsius heat. He lay on the sand, breathing heavily. His right leg was twisted unnaturally at the shin. An attempt to move his toes caused a flash of pain so intense that Mark momentarily blacked out. When he regained consciousness, the sun was already nearly at its zenith. It was no longer a celestial body. It had become an enemy. Mark realized he would not be able to walk. With an injury like this, every movement was a torture that only accelerated his heart rate and, consequently, his perspiration. The first rule of desert survival is moisture conservation. He had to stop the loss of fluid. Using a knife, he cut one of his trekking poles into sections to create a splint. Every movement was accompanied by a groan. He tightly wrapped his leg with an elastic bandage, trying to stabilize the bone fragments. Now he needed shade. Within a radius of several kilometers, there was not a single cave or tree. Only rare saxaul bushes that offered almost no protection. Mark dug a small depression under the edge of the gully where the wall offered some shield from direct rays. He stretched a reflective tent over himself, leaving a gap for air circulation. He lay motionless, trying to breathe only through his nose. Every exhale through the mouth was milliliters of water he could not afford to lose. By 3 in the afternoon, the heat became physically tangible. The air felt thick like syrup. Mark felt his skin becoming dry and paper-like. His head began to ache, a dull, band-like pain, the first sign of dehydration. He pulled out a flask. One sip, just one. He held the water in his mouth for several minutes, letting the mucous membrane absorb the moisture before swallowing. His thoughts began to wander. He remembered a cold shower in his apartment, the sound of water hitting the tiles. He remembered the taste of watermelon, sweet and cold. These thoughts were dangerous. They caused salivation, which he already lacked. Mark forced himself to focus on technical details. How many hours until sunset? What was the probability that they would start looking for him sooner than 44 hours from now? The answer was bleak. No one knew his exact route. When the sun finally began to set, the desert changed. Colors became deeper, shadows long and blue. But coolness did not come immediately. The stones continued to radiate heat. Mark knew that he had to do something at night. Staying in one place meant waiting for death. He began to crawl. It was incredibly difficult. He left his backpack behind, taking only water, his knife, a first aid kit, and a signal mirror. Every meter came at the cost of incredible effort. He moved on his elbows, dragging his injured leg behind him. After an hour, he had covered only 300 meters. His body was covered in dust, and his elbows were torn to blood. In the night, he heard a sound. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a quiet rustling. Mark froze. A few meters away, a lizard ran across the sand. He knew that there is moisture in the bodies of insects and reptiles, but he lacked the strength to hunt. Instead, he focused on finding plants. He found a small patch of succulents, desert plants that store water. He began to chew their leaves. They were bitter, full of alkali that made his tongue go numb, but it was liquid. By the third day, the thirst was unbearable. His urine had turned dark, almost brown, a sign that his kidneys were working at their limit. Mark began to see strange things. He imagined people in white robes walking along the horizon. He called out to them, but his voice was only a raspy whisper. He bit his own lips to drink a little of his own blood, but the blood was thick and clotted quickly. He remembered the solar still method. He dug a deep hole, placed his urine-soaked clothes at the bottom, they were his last moisture resource, and covered the hole with a plastic bag, placing a stone in the center. After a few hours under the scorching sun, drops of distilled water appeared on the inner surface of the plastic. It was a true miracle. He collected about 50 milliliters. This tiny portion of water returned his ability to think logically for a few more hours. On the third day, Mark was on the brink of death. His eyes were sunken. His skin had turned a grayish hue. He could no longer crawl. He lay on the crest of a dune he had climbed the previous night, hoping he would be easier to spot there. He had one thing left, the small signal mirror. He saw the sky. It was mercilessly clear, not a single cloud. Suddenly, he heard a low, vibrating hum. It didn't sound like a hallucination. The sound was real, mechanical. Mark gathered all his strength, raised the mirror, and began to catch the sunlight. His hand shook. He could barely see where he was directing the reflection. A black dot appeared far on the horizon. A helicopter. It flew parallel to the dune, not noticing the small figure in the sands. Mark desperately waved the mirror, sending flash after flash. "See me! See me!" he repeated like a mantra. The helicopter began to turn. Mark didn't believe his eyes. The hum grew louder, the wind from the blades kicking up a cloud of sand that stung his face. When the first rescuers jumped to the ground, Mark could no longer speak. He only tightly gripped the mirror in his hand, the small piece of glass that had proven stronger than the entire desert. He was evacuated to a hospital in Bukhara. Doctors would later say he survived only because of his iron discipline. He lost 15 kilograms, and his leg had to be operated on to install titanium plates. But he remained alive. A year later, Mark returned to the desert. This time, he didn't go for a trek. He simply stood on the edge of the plateau, watching the sunset. He held a bottle of water in his hand and slowly poured a little onto the sand. It was his tribute to this place. The desert had taught him the most important lesson. Life is not about achieving goals. It is every drop of water, every breath, and every second when you refuse to give up, even when the sun wants to turn you to ash. He turned and walked toward the car where his family was waiting. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. He knew the price of life, and that price was written in the scars on his leg and his eternal respect for the vast, hot silence of the desert. After returning to Bukhara and spending his first few weeks in the hospital, Mark's struggle didn't end. It simply changed form. Real survival in extreme conditions often has a long echo that doesn't fade just because the wounds have closed. The titanium plates in his leg became a permanent reminder of that day. Every step was initially accompanied by a dull ache, but the true challenge was his psychological state. During his first months back home in an ordinary city apartment, Mark couldn't sleep unless there was a supply of water nearby. He placed bottles all over the house, by the bed, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, and even in the hallway. It was the irrational habit of a man whose brain had forever recorded the horror of an empty hydration bladder. His wife, Olena, saw how he was changing. Mark became silent. When he looked at a bright lamp or the midday sun through the window, his pupils would involuntarily contract, and his hand would reach for his throat. The desert had left him with a thirst that could not be quenched by drinking. It was a thirst for meaning. 6 months after the incident, Mark decided to change his life. His job at a marketing agency now seemed like meaningless noise. He began studying hydrology and water resource engineering. He realized that his experience in the Kyzylkum was not just an accident, but a brutal lesson about the vulnerability of civilization. He began working on a volunteer project called Drop of Life. His goal was simple yet ambitious: to install autonomous water collection points based on solar distillation and atmospheric moisture condensation in arid regions where nomadic tribes live. He no longer wanted to conquer nature. He wanted to help others live in peace with it. His first prototype was an improved version of that very same pit with plastic that he had once dug with broken hands. Now, it was an elegant construction made of high-tech membranes and solar panels. When the project received a grant, Mark had to fly back to Central Asia. The plane descended over the same reddish sands. Olena held his hand, feeling him tense up. When the plane doors opened and the familiar scorched air rushed into the cabin, Mark did not flinch. He took a deep breath. This heat no longer frightened him. He knew it by name. At the site of the former shepherd's camp, where he had once drunk stagnant water, his device now stood. Mark watched as a local elderly shepherd approached the tap and filled a bowl with clear, cool water obtained literally from the air. The old man looked at Mark, placed his hand over his heart, and nodded. At that moment, Mark felt that the invisible wound in his soul, which had ached all year, finally healed. He realized he had survived not to become stronger than the desert, but to become its voice among people. In a rapidly warming world, his experience became not just a story of a failed marathoner, but a manual for the future. In the evening, sitting by the tent, this time with a vast supply of water and satellite communication, Mark pulled that same signal mirror from his pocket. It was scratched with a small chip on the corner. He looked at his reflection. A man who knew the price of every second, looked back at him. He didn't put the mirror away. He placed it on a stone facing the stars. "Thank you for the light," he whispered softly. The desert around him was silent, but it was no longer a hostile silence. It was the silence of a great, wise organism that had accepted him back, not as an enemy, but as a part of its infinite cycle. Mark fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of the sound of an empty bladder. He dreamed of rain falling on the scorched earth, and of how the sand began to smell of life.